who can respond to the questions around faith. Just a suggestion. Thank you very much.
So the people don't trust politicians, hold the front page. I think it's interesting, though, that I think the figure was, in 2006, 30% trusted government and politicians, and now it's 16%. And I think that's partly due to the fact that when people conform to this stereotype, trust disappears. So people throughout the centuries have always thought that politicians were lying bastards. Now, over the last 6 months, I think many politicians have conformed to that stereotype. I mean, Robert mentioned all of the sort of cash for peerages issue. It's not just that, it's the fact that people think that politicians spin all the time. It doesn't matter. I'm not just talking about one political party, it applies to all political parties. And similarly, I think if all of the other sectors had conformed to their stereotypes, you would have seen a similar drop. For example, I mean, there's a stereotype of NGOs being inefficient and bloated. If you think that they are, then you're going to say that you don't trust them as much. If you think that, if you conform to the business stereotype of being greedy and just out for profit, again, the trust factor will decline. And if religious people conform to the image of sort of narrow-minded zealots, again, people will lose confidence in religion. So I'm not sure that I'm surprised at the outcome on the political side. I think it's also partly due to the fact, and I think if you track this over the last 50 years, you would find that sort of 50 years ago generally, you would have found that politicians had a much higher level of trust than nowadays, partly because we've had the death of deference. People no longer believe that their leaders are these great people like Churchill. They feel that they have become empowered, and frankly, they know better than their leaders sometimes. And I think that the internet has really played a major role in this, where people have become empowered democratically. Maybe that hasn't exemplified itself so much yet, but I think over the next 10 years, this trend is going to increase a lot. People don't get their news now just from television and radio and newspapers. They get a lot of it from the internet. They form their opinions through the internet, and they can interact politically and democratically on the internet. I was interested in the figure for bloggers, obviously, and that sort of only 14% trust what they read on blogs. Again, I thought, should I be surprised by that? I mean, I was kind of disappointed, but I mean, it is apparently on an upward trend, and I suspect, again, over the next decade, you're going to see that figure rise as people find news sources, not just blogs, but news sources on the internet that they trust, possibly more than the mainstream media. On the media question, I think it was slightly, I think maybe the wrong question was asked. If you ask people, do you trust the media, I think generally you're going to have a negative answer. If you ask people, do you trust the BBC, I think you would have a very high level of trust. And I think it's the same in most of these questions. If they're generic, it's easy to say no. If they're specific, it's much more difficult. I mean, there are individual politicians who, if you say, well, do you trust, I don't know, Tony Benn, for example. I think he's now developed this image as a sort of lovable old rogue who you would actually quite like to have a drink with, and therefore you might trust. Whereas if you ask the question about someone who's actually in power and you see on your television screen all the time, you might have a different response. I think that this question of people like me is a very, very important one for politicians. And the successful politicians, from a media point of view, are those that when you see them on the television, you think, yes, that person is a bit like me. And the unsuccessful ones are the opposite. So when you see Patricia Hewitt talking about the health service, you switch off because you don't think that she's someone like you. Well, I hope you don't anyway. So I found that the slide with the sort of peer-to-peer axis is incredibly important for politicians. I hope you're going to send a copy of this to David Cameron, because I think there is one slide there that he can take heart from, and maybe he got there before you, I don't know, but this social responsibility slide, most of the Conservative message nowadays seems to revolve around social responsibility, climate change, social action. And the fact that that seems to be in tune with what the British people are thinking, from my point of view as a potential Conservative candidate, is a very good thing. And I don't see that, that the other two parties have quite cottoned on to that yet. So I think that the main message from that, from the political world, is that trust is a sort of highly personal thing, and you've got to get politicians who people can see that they are trustworthy. They've got to prove their credentials, and I think that's all I've got. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for all those contributions. We have some time for questions from the audience to our panel. Hugh.
Hi. Disclosure. Before I was a blogger, my career unfortunately was in advertising. I wrote TV commercials, and I guess what's coming through my head. Great speeches, by the way. Great presentations. As people trying to get messages out on clients' behalf, and I guess that's what you guys do for a living, where do you, in your own business, where do you see the opportunity for you guys?
Richard.
Hugh, I think great campaigns today actually envisage the sort of vertical and horizontal axis. So like the Dove campaign for Real Beauty. There's an issue with this, which is that women's self-image is poor, and there's a solution for it, which is education, particularly, as I have 3 daughters, you know, at young age, about everyone's beautiful. And that the campaign, in fact, for Real Beauty is based on an intellectual premise. It has education. It has a place to make donation. It gives something back to society. It's not just about selling soap. And in fact, the ad component of it is much less than the usual campaign. It's just billboards. There's a big online component. There's obviously a lot of PR. So I think that that's indicative of the way smart marketers are thinking.
Okay. I'm glad you brought that one up, because when you're talking about trust, there are 2 words that come to mind. One is meaning. Okay, we want meaning in our lives, and we want brands and companies and organizations to make our lives more meaningful or easier to believe in what we're doing. So there's meaning, but there's also, with the Dove campaign, there's a certain vulnerability from the company, from Dove. It's a potential. There's a certain kind of vulnerability from Unilever to do that, as opposed to just hiring some supermodels and parading them up and down a catwalk in their underwear.
No, they're real girls.
Exactly.
And they're real stories, and,
but the reality is
they're vulnerable. And they're not controlled messages, and I think that's what makes it credible.
But that's all. It's a risk thing, and if you risk vulnerability, you come back a lot stronger. So that's just an observation, but thank you very much.
Just taking up Hugh's point, just from a communications point of view, I mean, particularly for Amnesty, Irene, do you think that there's things that you will do differently?
Well, I think what we have discovered in Amnesty is, we started very much as an organization of individuals for individuals. Political prisoners adopting little groups around the world would adopt political prisoners. Over the last 4 decades or so, we have moved on to issues. We now talk not about political prisoners, but about fair trial. We talk about poverty. We talk about violence against women, and so on. And as we've done that, we've realized that what has given us strength has been when we have been able to connect with people, not with issues. So for us, working on individual cases is still very important. For us, reaching out to individual activists is still very important. And right now in Amnesty, we have an organizational growth strategy that is actually based on going back to how we connect people with people somewhere else. Maybe activists in the North with survivors of human rights abuses in the South, or individuals who are themselves being empowered, local community groups, and so on. So again, this whole notion of peer-to-peer works as much for us as a human rights organization as you were saying it does for business.
Ian?
I think it's also partly about dialogue.